Hey guys, Youngblood with you, and today I wanted to cover the combat effectiveness of the Esperia Talon. Now first off, we're really only talking about the Talon model, not the Shrike. Now if I was to give you a quick and dirty review there, the Shrike does well enough using its missiles, but players can avoid them pretty easily right now, and the NPCs die pretty quickly to them. So depending on your target, you're going to have some success, but either way, you are going to have to return to rearm them, and missiles can add up in cost for rearming fees, so it's a little bit of a trade-off. Now, the one I really want to focus on here is more of the dedicated fighter one, being the Talon. Components-wise, we already discussed it, but it mostly comes with size 1C grade military components, which is alright, but not stellar. I didn't actually upgrade any components because I wanted a more out-of-the-box experience, but I did swap to my preferred NPC hunting weapons loadout so I could actually do a little better comparison, and that's the laser repeaters. And on this, I dropped the gimbal in favor of size 4's fixed rhinos, which are laser repeaters. Now, they actually look a little ridiculous hanging off the bottom of this little ship, but that's okay. Now, the first thing that I noticed in 3.12, you have to pay to do bounty certifications. It's kind of replacing the old Pro Tem mission. And I had already pulled my Talon, and that's when I realized how tiny the fuel tank is on the ship, because I couldn't even make it to Crusader from Hurston. Now, granted, the beacon that is on there is a hungry little crappy drive. It's not something you want to use. So putting something on like an Atlas would probably get the job done and actually get you all the way over to the different planets, but you would probably need to refuel constantly as you're jumping around. So from that perspective, unless you don't mind a bunch of refueling stops, this ship is really going to be best reserved for usage around a planetary system like the moons around Hurston or the moons around Crusader, at least until carriers come into the fold. Now, as far as the flight model is concerned, it is incredibly agile, especially in regards to the roll and pitch rates, and it basically does exactly what you want it to do. Now, I'll say that on a lot of the more agile fighters, I typically prefer the gimbal over the fixed because it can be hard to stay on your pip when the ship is almost twitchy. There's a lot of oversteering in a way, or overcorrecting when you're trying to stop your direction. Now, I don't feel this really had that same issue for me. So fixed size 4s were fine, and I didn't feel like I was missing out not having the gimbal. That being said, my player combat experience in this has been fairly minimal, with me mostly hunting NPCs is how I spent my time. Overall, the ship feels a lot like the Arrow, if you're familiar with that ship. You bring 2 size 4 weapons where the Arrow can bring 3 size 3s, which if you're looking at laser cannons equals out perfectly on the DPS perspective. Now, later on, the larger hardpoints that you can bring and the larger weaponry you can bring on the Talon is going to mean that you can carry better penetration values against armor, but we're not there yet. You also have to consider that the Arrow, with 3 hardpoints, has a little bit more redundancy in case of a weapon going down. For example, at 1320 DPS, the 2 Rhinos, if you lose one of those on the Talon, you're down to 660 DPS. On the Arrow, that 1320 DPS is spread between 3 Panthers. If you lose one, you're down to 880. Long term, I probably prefer the larger weapons that allow for better penetration values and leveraging the ship's ability and agility to get behind the larger targets instead of really brawling with them. The Talon also has 2 small shield generators instead of 1 on the Arrow, which is the greatest weakness of the Arrow. Now, where it stands now, they are similarly priced ships, but the Talon feels like an upgrade overall. There is a wild card here, though, and that's really how distortion ends up playing out. The 311 meta was to mix in some distortion weapons, which are fairly OP in their ability to strip down shields. On the Arrow, having 3 hardpoints, that means that you can dedicate one to distortion and still have 2 other weapons for actually dealing the damage. While on the Talon, you only have the 2 hardpoints, so you would end up having 1 damage-yielding weapon if you opted to make the other one distortion. How that balance ends up playing a factor in the long run, we don't really know, but we'll have to monitor that. Against NPCs, though, it's strong, where you're able to knock out your targets fairly easily, especially one-on-one. The vernacular is changing to some degree in 3.12, but in prior patches, the bounty scale was CS1 through CS4, and that determined how many targets you actually had to kill. And the Talon, at least in the old terminology, I would say, does really well going up until about a CS3. It's not really durable enough to manage the CS4s or the Arlington gang missions by yourself, where you have to manage a bunch of other enemy targets. Unless you're okay with playing smart and taking a long time and you're flying in and out and just kind of peeling off targets. Against players, it's a similar story, where this does well enough against ships like the Arrow, the Gladius, even the Saber, but on these ships it really comes down to skill level. I think the Saber wins this fight almost every time, but the Arrow and the Gladius are a little bit closer. I do think it's fast and agile enough to get behind things like the Vanguards, the Freelancers, the Cuddies, the Constellations, where you could actually do some real damage without taking too much flak, even having the ability to avoid some of that turret fire if you're smart in your positioning. Overall, I would say that the Talon is a fun little ship. It's effective at combat and an appealing, cool ship for the price, and it has a nice design. I think that once the cockpit actually decides to stay closed during your flight, which can be quite disruptive in this ship, then it's a legit combat ship, though I do think it's a little bit more limited than I care for. The other call out is one that I've experienced on the Prowler that applies here, and that's that the cockpit is a screen. It's not a window. So if you get EMP'd, that screen goes down and you can't see anything. And that is a pretty major problem and a balanced nightmare, depending on how strong EMPs end up being. And that's something that could very easily break you in a fight. So that's it overall on this. Stay tuned for more coming up soon. I think the next video is going to be covering the INS Jericho station that is in 312, so keep an eye out for that coming very soon. Have yourselves a wonderful day, and take care.